January 14, 1945, before dawn, the German frontier. A thin layer of frost clings to the shattered trees along the ridgeline. The sky is black, heavy, waiting. Below, in a narrow valley carved by winter wind and artillery fire, a U.S. battalion moves in silence. Helmets glint faintly beneath the moonlight. Breath rises in pale clouds. Rifles are carried low. Every man knows what stands ahead of them. 8 defensive lines. 8 belts of wire, mines, trenches, bunkers, and concealed machine gun nests, built to break momentum, to slow any advance to a crawl, to force an army to bleed for every yard. No unit has yet crossed all of them in a single operation. German commanders consider these fortifications immovable, impenetrable, the final shield before the Rhine. But tonight, the valley feels different. Artillery crews whisper final adjustments. Engineers check their charges. Officers study watches, waiting for the minute when the darkness will erupt. The men are exhausted, hungry, and cold, yet something holds steady inside them, a resolve born from months of brutal fighting. When the first gun fires, the night tears open like a seam of light, and the battalion begins the push that will rewrite everything. How the battlefield took shape before the breakthrough. By early 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final violent grind. Germany was collapsing, but not yet broken. Every mile of ground the Allies seized came with a cost measured in blood, steel, and time. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, had failed, but it left behind a scarred front filled with shattered forests, frozen rivers, wrecked villages, and scattered pockets of resistance that refused to yield. In this chaos, German commanders sought something they could still control: defensive depth. They understood they could no longer outnumber American formations. They could no longer outrun them, but they could slow them, delay them, force them to bleed against fortified lines that had been hardened by months of retreat and desperation. These belts of defense were not uniform. Some positions were built from long-standing west wall fortifications, thick concrete bunkers left over from the early war years. Others were improvised, trenches dug by exhausted infantry, machine gun nests carved into basements of ruined farmhouses, crossroads mined in panic and haste. Anti-tank guns were dragged into place by whatever vehicles remained. Mortar teams took shelter in collapsed barns. Each line was a mixture of planning and improvisation, but all shared a single purpose: slow the American advance at any cost. Across the front, U.S. commanders studied the German defenses and recognized a pattern. The lines were weakened by shortages of fuel, ammunition, and manpower, but their layout, stacked one behind the other, meant that any breakthrough required coordination, speed, and discipline. A stalled advance would give German reserves time to counterattack. A disorganized push would give German artillery the chance to exact a heavy toll. Into this environment stepped the American battalion, one of many formations pressing east, but soon to become one of the few that would carve its name into the final chapters of the war. The unit was not fresh. Its soldiers had marched through mud in France, frozen through autumn in Belgium, and survived the chaos of the Bulge. Their boots were worn, their packs were lighter than they should have been, but their experience was heavy, and it shaped every decision they made. What gave them their edge was not numbers, it was momentum, a sense that the German front, once immovable, now bent under pressure. The intelligence reports arriving at battalion headquarters painted a contradictory picture. Some sectors showed signs of collapse, others bristled with new defensive preparations. Prisoner interrogations revealed infantry units made up of older men, young conscripts, and fragments of once elite formations now reduced to a fraction of their strength. Yet even weakened German positions could be deadly if attacked without precision. The battalion's mission was clear: break through 8 defensive lines in 48 hours. Not 1, not 3, all 8. Why the rush? Because behind those lines stretched the final approach to the Rhine, Germany's last natural barrier before the heartland. The sooner the Americans reached it, the sooner they could deny the Wehrmacht time to reorganize. Every hour mattered. Every delay risked giving German commanders the breathing room to rebuild strength for one final stand. Planning for the assault began in a small stone farmhouse converted into a command post. Maps covered the walls. A wood stove fought the cold. Officers pored over intelligence sketches, aerial reconnaissance, and hurried field reports. Engineers described minefield patterns. Artillery teams calculated fire missions. Squad leaders memorized terrain: creeks, ridgelines, hedgerows, burned-out vehicles, anything that could give cover or cost lives. What concerned the battalion commander most was not the enemy's strength, it was the terrain. The valley narrowed in several places, funneling any attack into predictable corridors. German machine guns could cut across these choke points.
Mortars hidden in woods could fire unseen and retreat before counter-battery fire could reach them. Anti-tank guns, though limited in number, were positioned to cover likely approach routes. Any hesitation could trap the battalion in a killing zone. But retreat was not an option. The overall offensive required forward movement, and the battalion had earned a reputation for performing under pressure. Fast assaults, disciplined fire control, and the ability to maintain cohesion amid confusion. They had done it before. They would do it again. The night before the attack, snow fell lightly on the valley. Men cleaned their rifles, checked their ammunition, and shared quiet moments over steaming rations. Some wrote letters, some prayed. Some simply stared into the dark, listening to the distant rumble of artillery like thunder rolling over distant hills. They knew the 8 lines ahead of them contained more than barbed wire and trenches. They contained the final resolve of an army fighting on its own soil, and the next step would bring them face to face with it. The German defensive network the battalion now faced did not emerge overnight. It was the product of a year-long collapse stretching from Normandy to the Ardennes, where every retreating unit sought footholds, places where ground, terrain, and memory might allow them to stand again. As the Reich shrank, these improvised strongpoints accumulated into layered belts of resistance. Each belt was meant to buy time. Each delay, no matter how small, offered German commanders a chance, however faint, to regroup somewhere deeper inside Germany. By early 1945, the boundaries of these defensive layers took shape along ridges, rivers, and villages that once had little military significance. Engineers who once built forward positions for expansion now built rear positions for survival. West wall bunkers that had been empty museum pieces only months earlier were reactivated. Anti-aircraft guns were lowered to engage ground targets. Communications trenches were dug by torchlight through frozen earth. The battalion sector lay at a point where several of these defensive lines converged. On aerial photographs, the structure was unmistakable. 8 successive layers of obstacles, each positioned to slow or fracture an assault long enough for artillery and reserves to respond. That design reflected a confident army, but the reality in front of the Americans reflected a different truth. An army stretched thin, forced to defend everything because it could defend nothing fully. Within the German ranks, morale had fractured into extremes. Some soldiers, veterans of campaigns dating back to Poland and France, believed the war was nearing its end, and that continued fighting served only delay. Others, especially younger troops raised under years of propaganda, fought with a desperate conviction shaped not by victory but by fear of defeat. Mixed among them were foreign conscripts from occupied territories, men with little allegiance to the Reich but no safe path of escape. This complicated mix created unpredictable resistance. Some positions fought to the last cartridge, others broke apart under the first shell burst. For American commanders preparing the assault, that inconsistency was a danger unto itself. Predictability, even of strength, could be planned for, but unpredictability meant surprise, both good and deadly. The intelligence section of the battalion assessed that the first 3 lines were manned by infantry remnants, likely static units or fortress battalions light and heavy weapons. But beyond them the situation changed. Reports indicated the presence of elements from a Panzer Grenadier division positioned near the 4th and 5th lines. These troops, though diminished, were experienced and well armed. Their positions were supported by concealed anti-tank guns, and at least 1 battery of 105mm field artillery. And somewhere behind the 8th line, though details were scarce, was the command post coordinating the entire system of defenses. That command post became the battalion's ultimate goal.
American doctrine emphasized speed and pressure, maintaining momentum even when encountering fortified positions. But in winter terrain, speed was difficult. Snow concealed mines and barbed wire. Frozen ground limited safe digging for cover. Dense forests turned visibility into a guessing game. And the enemy still held the high ground, giving their machine gunners wide arcs across the valley floor. To compensate, the battalion coordinated closely with artillery. Fire missions were plotted in advance, creeping barrages, smoke screens, counter-battery fire, and illumination flares to expose German positions before dawn. Engineers rehearsed clearing gaps in wire and mines, their hands adjusting charges by lantern light. Communications teams laid wire behind the expected point of advance, ensuring contact would not collapse under the first burst of enemy shelling. As preparations unfolded, the bigger strategic picture weighed heavily over the operation. Allied forces needed to reach the Rhine quickly to prevent the formation of a coherent defensive line deeper inside Germany. The speed of the advance in this sector directly influenced the pace of the campaign for the entire front. If the battalion failed to break the German lines, it would not merely stall progress here, it would allow German commanders time to shift reserves, reposition artillery, or evacuate crucial infrastructure. That urgency shaped the tone in the battalion headquarters. Officers spoke quietly but directly. There was no bravado, no illusions. The men were told the truth. The lines ahead could be formidable. The Germans had proven throughout the war that they fought hardest when the war neared their homeland. Yet they were also fragile, stretched thin, plagued by shortages, losing the cohesion they once commanded. The battalion's commander summarized the situation in a short, steady sentence, repeated by officers throughout the night. Quote, "We move fast, or we don't move at all." It was more than tactical advice. It was a recognition of the battlefield's reality. Forward pressure was their only chance to avoid becoming trapped in an extended fight that could bleed them dry. By the time the final briefing ended, the sky had begun to pale with the earliest hint of dawn. The front was quiet, too quiet for a battlefield positioned so close to the enemy. Somewhere across the valley, German troops adjusted their helmets and tightened their coats, listening in the same cold silence for signs of the impending storm. And when that silence finally broke, it would mark the beginning of a 48-hour surge that would test every lesson, every instinct, and every ounce of resolve the battalion had carried through the long march into Germany. The next step forward would push them into the first of 8 lines. And the momentum of the entire front rested on what happened there: the human weight, exhaustion, resolve, and the psychology of forward motion. For the men of the battalion, the operation did not begin with the crack of artillery. It began with the weight of accumulated months. Months of mud, cold, sleepless nights in foxholes, and the dull ache of marching through villages reduced to rubble. Many had fought since France, some since Normandy. Faces were leaner now. Letters home were shorter. Humor softened into quiet endurance. Yet those same men carried something the German lines could not replicate: momentum. They had seen German defenses break before. They had watched strong points collapse under coordinated fire. They had learned the rhythm of the enemy's retreat, rigid resistance followed by sudden fractures. They understood that the German army they now face was not the one that had stormed across Europe in 1940. This one was fighting backwards, fighting for time, fighting without reserves, fuel, or air cover. In the final hours before the assault, soldiers huddled beside heaters or crouched inside shallow foxholes, rubbing stiff hands together and checking rifles with practiced motions. There was fear, yes, but also something steadier, a collective understanding that their advance was part of a much larger collapse, that every German line they broke would hasten the end. And at the first break of fire, when the valley erupted in flashes and thunder, that understanding would become action, a human push into the first belt of defenses, a test of will against wire, mines, and steel, a beginning that promised 7 harder lines still ahead: tactical calculus, how to break 8 defensive lines in rapid succession. Breaking 1 fortified line requires coordination, pressure, and adaptability. Breaking 8 in 48 hours demands precision bordering on impossibility. American doctrine focused on synchronizing infantry, engineers, artillery, and armor in waves, each moving at a pace that prevented the enemy from resetting. To sustain that pace against 8 lines, the battalion staff created a plan built like a sequence of gears, each turning the next. The first gear, shock. Artillery would smash the forward trenches and blind machine gun nests with smoke. Engineers would advance immediately behind the final shells to breach wire. Infantry squads would move in staggered formations, using terrain folds for cover. The second gear, compression. Once a line was penetrated, platoons would fan outward, widening the breach before German defenders could tighten it. This tactic prevented counterattacks from isolating the lead elements. The third gear, continuity. Officers designated leapfrogging units, fresh platoons positioned to push the assault forward while the first wave reloaded, reorganized, or tended casualties. This ensured that the Germans never saw a lull, never regained composure, never stabilized their fire. And behind all of it, radio operators maintained continuous communication with artillery batteries miles away. Fire could be called in minutes. Corrections could be made in seconds. The battalion's advance would be measured not in yards per hour, but in whether the Germans could react fast enough to stop a machine already in motion. Everything depended on that speed, and the enemy was about to feel its pressure. Enemy perspective, German confusion, overextension, and the crumbling concept of defense. From the German trenches, the American buildup was felt long before it was seen. Sound travels strangely in winter valleys, muffled, then suddenly amplified, and reports from listening posts told commanders that something larger than a routine probe was coming, but they did not know when, they did not know from where, and most critically, they did not know how fast it would move once it started. German soldiers were veterans of static defense. They knew how to hold a trench, how to repel a frontal assault, how to fall back to secondary positions while maintaining fire. But the reality in 1945 stripped these skills of their power. Their machine guns lacked ammunition. Their mortars lacked replacement tubes. Their artillery could fire only fractionally compared to American batteries. Reinforcements, when requested, often never arrived. What the defenders feared most was not American strength, it was American tempo. A fast-moving battalion could break a line before messages reached the next defensive belt. It could overwhelm one point, then split into 2 directions, confusing response teams and disrupted prepared fields of fire. Every break forced defenders to reposition, and every reposition risked being caught by artillery. By the time the first American shells landed, many German commanders already sensed a truth they could not voice openly.
The lines they manned were barriers on paper, not the wall they once had been. And as the first U.S. platoons surged through the smoke toward the trenches, the defenders braced for the beginning of an advance that might not stop. Technology and firepower, the American arsenal that made defense obsolete. No matter how determined the defenders or how well prepared the trenches, the battlefield of 1945 had become a contest defined by firepower. And in this contest, the United States possessed an advantage so overwhelming that German officers increasingly described it as unfair physics rather than tactics. American artillery was the backbone of this imbalance. The battalion could call upon 105mm and 155mm howitzers positioned miles behind the lines, each capable of firing with accuracy unimaginable only years ago. Forward observers with compact radios, some no larger than a book, could relay coordinates rapidly, adjusting fire in real time. German communications often relied on wire lines that froze, snapped, or were destroyed by shell bursts. The Americans could shift destructive force with a few spoken numbers. Then came the mortars. Lightweight, easy to reposition, and abundant, they allowed platoons to supply their own indirect fire, raining explosives on trenches before infantry even reached them. German mortar teams, fewer in number and short on ammunition, often hesitated to reveal their positions for fear of drawing immediate counterfire. Small arms superiority compounded the pressure. Semi-automatic rifles like the M1 Garand allowed American infantry to maintain a volume of fire that German bolt-action rifles simply could not match. In close quarters, the BAR and Thompson submachine gun overwhelmed defenders attempting to reposition within bunkers and dugouts. Together, this arsenal transformed every American assault into a moving storm. Each defensive line, no matter how thick, faced the same sequence: locate, bombard, breach, overwhelm. And as the battalion advanced toward the 4th and 5th lines, where German panzer grenadiers waited, the true test of this firepower was about to unfold. Leadership and adaptation, command decisions under relentless pressure. While firepower shaped the battlefield, leadership determined how effectively it was applied. The battalion's officers were veterans of varied fights: Normandy's hedgerows, the breakout at St. Lo, the Hurtgen forest's grinding attrition. Each experience had carved into them a shared truth: nothing in war remained predictable for more than a few minutes. That truth became the core of their planning. Maps were updated hourly. Platoon leaders received authority to reroute paths on their own initiative. If a breach succeeded faster than expected, follow-on units were pushed through immediately. If resistance stiffened, artillery and armor shifted without waiting for elaborate paperwork. The battalion operated on a doctrine of elastic momentum: bend when needed, never break, and always keep the enemy reacting rather than acting. Communications officers played a pivotal role in maintaining this tempo. Radio channels buzzed with coded updates: Line 1 breached, machine gun nest south flank suppressed, request smoke on trench sector C4. These rapid exchanges allowed the battalion commander to shape the battle minute by minute, ensuring the Germans never found a stable footing. At the same time, junior leaders improvised under fire. Sergeants directed squads around minefields discovered too late for engineers to clear. Lieutenants coordinated fire from shattered barns or shell holes, turning them into temporary command posts. Medics stabilized wounded men so the assault wouldn't stall. Leadership here was not about speeches or rigid plans. It was about the ability to make dozens of correct decisions, rapidly, under the weight of exhaustion and fear. And those decisions became the reason the battalion approached the halfway point of the defenses with its momentum intact. But ahead, the enemy's resolve hardened. The strongest lines and the fiercest resistance still waited. The German breakdown, logistics, communications, and the slow collapse of cohesion. From the German perspective, the battle unfolded like a tightening vice. Their lines had been built for layered resistance: fall back from one to the next, regroup, and force the Americans to fight again and again. But this system relied on two conditions: time and communication. By early 1945, Germany had neither.
Fuel shortages crippled mobility. Trucks ran on fumes. Some units relied on horse-drawn carts to move ammunition. Radios were scarce, sometimes shared between entire companies. Wire communications snapped under bombardment or froze in the winter cold. Orders often arrived too late to matter, or not at all. When the Americans broke the first two lines, German officers attempted to reform units at the third, but artillery disrupted their assembly areas. Machine gunners attempting to reposition were caught in open terrain and forced back. Anti-tank crews dug in along the fourth line, waited anxiously for armor that never appeared, because the battalion was advancing on foot and with overwhelming indirect fire. Morale wavered. Some troops fought fiercely, determined to hold ground until the last possible moment. Others fell back as soon as the first shells landed, not out of cowardice, but from a mounting sense that the defense was collapsing everywhere, not just in their sector. Each retreat compressed the battlefield, creating bottlenecks where fleeing troops collided with fresh defenders, spreading confusion and fear. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but the chain of command dissolved further with every breach. By the time the Americans neared the fifth line, the Germans were fighting not to repel an assault, but to prevent disintegration. And that disintegration would set the stage for the critical moment to come, the turning point where the battalion's advance would meet its fiercest trial. The first 4 defensive belts had fallen faster than any intelligence estimate predicted. The battalion advanced through the smoke, stepping over shadowed wire, past burning bunkers, through broken trenches where dazed German soldiers surrendered in small clusters or fled deeper into the forest. Momentum held steady. But the fifth line was different. This was the point where scattered static units ended and where hardened panzer grenadiers began. The terrain changed abruptly. A narrow ridge rose ahead, giving the Germans overlapping fields of fire. Trenches were deeper, dug into frost-hardened clay. Machine gun positions were reinforced with timber and stone. Anti-tank guns covered the valley approach, even though armor had not yet entered the battle. And behind it all, mortars were positioned to fire in plunging arcs across every likely avenue of assault. At 0940 hours, as the battalion advanced toward the crest, the German defense revealed its full strength. The opening burst came from the left flank, a pair of MG-42s firing at over 1,200 rounds per minute, stitching the snow with lines of sparks and dust. Mortars followed seconds later, scattering the lead platoon and forcing the men into shallow depressions carved by previous shell bursts. Riflemen along the ridge fired in disciplined volleys, their shots echoing against the valley walls. For the first time since dawn, the battalion's advance stalled. The commander immediately recognized the danger. If the battalion became pinned here, the German defenders could launch a local counterattack, not to destroy the Americans, but to delay them, long enough to allow units behind the 6th and 7th lines to reorganize. Delay was the true weapon of the German army now. A few stalled hours could fracture the entire 48-hour objective. He ordered artillery on the ridge. But the German positions were expertly concealed. Shells landed behind them, beside them, in front of them, yet the machine guns kept firing, each burst forcing the Americans lower into the frozen earth. The mortars adjusted as well, bracketing the battalion with unnerving speed. Engineers crawled forward under fire, attempting to mark safe lanes through suspected mines. Twice they were forced back by bursts of enfilade fire that swept across the ridge like blades of wind. Medics worked through the chaos, dragging wounded men to cover, applying bandages with numb fingers. Every minute the attack stalled, the Germans grew more confident. This was the moment they had prepared for, a point where terrain, fortification, and training converged. A point where they believed the Americans would bleed, hesitate, then pull back to reorganize. But the battalion did not pull back. Instead, the commander made a decision that shifted the momentum of the entire battle. He restructured the assault on the fly. The decision, a shift in axis. Rather than pushing directly into the ridge's teeth, he split the battalion into 2 converging elements. One platoon would maintain suppressive fire, drawing German attention, pinning gunners, forcing mortar adjustments. The other would swing wide through a patch of dense forest on the right flank. A narrow deer trail wound through the trees, hidden from the ridge by a screen of pines and snow-laden underbrush. It was a risk. The trail was unscouted. Mines could be hidden beneath the snow. German outposts might be waiting along its length. But maintaining the current frontal approach was impossible. The Germans had created a perfect killing zone. Speed, once again, was the only option. The maneuver group moved quickly, spreading out, stepping lightly through powdery snow to avoid detection. Smoke shells from American mortars drifted across the valley floor, creating shifting curtains of gray that masked their movement. The suppressive fire group increased their volume of fire, pouring rounds toward German muzzle flashes. On the ridge, the Germans detected something was wrong. Machine guns pivoted, mortar crews adjusted. A shouted order carried faintly across the cold wind, but it was too late. The Americans emerged from the tree line at an angle the defenders had not prepared for. BAR gunners laid down sweeping fire. Riflemen advanced in pairs, bounding between shattered tree stumps. A squad armed with grenades moved toward the trench lip. The Germans turned to meet the new threat, but the shift exposed their flank to the original suppressive fire group. For a brief, decisive moment, their fields of fire overlapped in the wrong direction. Their defensive discipline wavered, and the battalion surged. The breach. Grenades burst inside the trench. A machine gun team went silent. Rifle fire faltered. Mortar crews abandoned their tubes as the Americans poured down from the flank and up from the valley simultaneously. Within minutes, the 5th line, expected to hold for hours, began to collapse. German troops retreated toward the 6th, stumbling through the snow, leaving equipment behind. Others surrendered, dropping rifles and raising hands as American squads swept through the trenches. The ridge fell, and the path to the final 3 lines opened. But the battalion had paid for the position, in time, in ammunition, and in casualties. The 6th line would not allow them to recover. It would force them into the most intense fight of the entire advance.
The capture of the 5th line sent a shockwave through the German defenses. Radio messages crackled through bunkers. Flanke gebrochen, Rückzug. The ridge that had anchored the entire sector was gone, and every line behind it now risks being outflanked or abandoned before reinforcements could arrive. But the battalion had no time to celebrate that success. As they pushed forward, exhaustion pressed heavily on every soldier. Their uniforms were stiff with frozen sweat. Ammunition belts were lighter. The adrenaline that had carried them through the ridge now turned into a dull ache across shoulders and legs. Yet the objective remained unchanged: break all 8 lines within the 48-hour window. And ahead of them, the 6th line waited. The 6th line, a wall of fire. Unlike the sprawling defensive of the 5th line, the 6th was compact, concentrated along a narrow defile between 2 rising slopes. The Germans had chosen this location deliberately. Here, their machine guns could funnel the Americans into a contained kill zone. Mortars were pre-zeroed. Anti-tank guns, though facing infantry without armor, were angled downward to fire high-explosive shells that tore apart tree limbs and sent splinters raining on advancing troops. The battalion entered that defile at 11:20 hours. The world exploded. A barrage of machine gun fire raked the ground. Mortars burst overhead, showering men with earth and shrapnel. Trees snapped like brittle bones. Platoons scattered sideways, seeking any depression or fold in the terrain. Communications momentarily faltered as radio operators dove for cover. Medics struggled to pull wounded men away from collapsing trees and burning underbrush. Momentum, the battalion's greatest weapon, threatened to die here, but the commander had anticipated this. The response: raw speed and artillery precision. Within minutes, forward observers relayed precise coordinates for the mortar nests and machine gun apertures. American artillery, miles behind the front, shifted fire in a coordinated sequence, first smothering the defile with smoke, then hammering the trench lip with high explosives. The valley trembled. Under the concealment of the smoke, the battalion advanced rapidly, bounding forward, firing as they moved. Engineers cleared narrow paths along each slope. The Germans, choked by smoke and overwhelmed by the sudden counterfire, lost their ability to track the assault accurately. By 11:05 hours, less than an hour after first contact, the 6th line cracked. Fragments of 2 German companies retreated in disarray toward the 7th line. Their defensive cohesion began to unravel. Their ammunition was nearly spent. Officers shouted orders that could barely be heard over the artillery. And yet, the 7th line still stood. The 7th line, a wall of steel. If the 6th line was fire, the 7th was steel. This line incorporated reinforced bunkers, firing slits angled to cover multiple approaches, and interlocking trenches forming a hoop-shaped barrier. The Germans here were remnants of a veteran regiment, men pulled back from earlier battles because of attrition, now serving as the backbone of the defense. They had one mission: hold long enough for reinforcements or a counterattack to form behind the 8th and final line. At 1:30 p.m., as the battalion reached visual contact with the 7th line, smoke drifted across the snow. The wind cut sharply from the east. The silence lasted only seconds. Then the Germans opened fire. It was a disciplined, controlled volley, the kind only experienced troops could deliver. Machine guns traced precise arcs, riflemen targeting officers. Mortars struck the exact points where American squads would naturally seek cover. This line would not break easily.
The battalion responded with coordinated aggression. Fire teams advanced in bounding overwatch, 2 moving while 2 covered, inch by inch across the open ground. Bar gunners poured suppressive fire into bunker slits. Grenadiers crawled forward, dragging satchel charges behind them. Engineers worked furiously to cut new lanes through barbed wire. Understood one thing: if the 7th line held until nightfall, the mission would fail. The breakthrough, an impossible assault. At 14:15 hours, the battalion's right flank identified a narrow fold in the terrain, a shallow draw that led toward the center of the German position. It provided minimal cover, but enough to stage a concentrated assault. The commander made the call. 3 platoons surged into that corridor. German machine gunners saw the movement and shifted fire, but that shift exposed their flank to the battalion's left side mortars. Explosions rocked the trenches. A bunker door shattered under a satchel charge. Smoke poured from firing slits as German gunners abandoned their posts or collapsed under debris. American infantry climbed the final slope in a brutal, desperate sprint. Grenades flew. Rifles cracked. Bars thundered. The 7th line caved inward. German troops retreated in disorder, stumbling through trenches, dropping weapons, pulling wounded comrades away from collapsing bunkers. Officers attempted to rally them, but artillery fire smashed their command posts. By 1500 hours, after 2 relentless hours of combat, the 7th line fell. But the battle was not over. Ahead lay the 8th and final line. No more layers, no more buffers. Just one last defensive belt between the battalion and complete operational victory. And the Germans, fully aware of what breaking that final line would mean, were already preparing to make their last stand. When the battalion reached the 8th and final German defensive belt, the sun was already sinking behind the fractured tree line. The light turned the snow a muted gold, casting long shadows across the battlefield. Smoke drifted in low sheets. The ground trembled faintly from distant artillery exchanges across the broader front. The air carried the sharp, metallic scent of explosives.
and ahead of them stood the last obstacle. The 8th Line was not the strongest in construction. It lacked the deep trenches and interlocking bunkers of the 7th. But what it lacked in fortification, it made up for in determination. The Germans who manned it were the remnants of every unit the battalion had fought that day: panzer grenadiers, infantrymen, artillery crews, dispatch riders, medics, even clerks pulled from field offices. Anyone who could hold a rifle had been sent forward. They understood what this line meant. If it fell, there would be no time to form another, no fallback position, no reserve to plug the breach. Behind them were only scattered rear headquarters, supply depots, and the final roads leading deeper into Germany. This was the last hinge on which the door to the Rhine still hung. At 1400 hours, American artillery opened the final preparation fire. Shells erupted across the German line, tearing apart hastily constructed foxholes and collapsing bunkers made from logs and frozen earth. Smoke shells bloomed, obscuring German vision and masking American approach routes. But even under bombardment, the defenders fired back. Machine gun bursts cut through the smoke. Mortars lobbed shells blindly into the valley. Riflemen fired at muzzle flashes and movement rather than clear targets. When the barrage lifted, the battalion moved. The final advance. The assault unfolded in coordinated waves. First came the fire teams, sprinting forward in short bursts, dropping into prone positions as riflemen laid suppressive fire. Bar gunners swept the ridge with broad arcs of automatic fire. Engineers followed, clearing wire under conditions so dangerous that every 5 feet felt like a lifetime. German defenders fought savagely. A machine gun team inside a sunken trench cut down 2 Americans before being silenced by a grenade. A group of panzer grenadiers counterattacked on the left, attempting to drive a wedge between 2 American platoons. They were met by concentrated rifle fire and forced back within minutes. Mortar rounds slammed into the battalion's right flank, wounding several men and forcing a brief halt. But the momentum never stopped. The battalion pushed forward steadily, relentlessly, climbing the gentle rise that formed the 8th Line's anchor. More Germans fled than fought now. Others threw down their weapons and raised their hands, emerging from clouds of smoke with faces gray from exhaustion and fear. Some simply crouched in their holes, too stunned to continue the fight. And then, at 17:12 hours, it happened. The battalion reached the crest. The last German position fell. A white cloth, torn from a shirt, rose shakily from a bunker where the final defenders surrendered. American soldiers secured the ridge, scanning for counterattacks that never came. The resistance behind the 8th Line had simply run out of men, ammunition, and time. What the break meant immediately. Once the ridge was secured, scouts moved beyond it and reported what the Germans feared most. There were no additional defensive lines, no prepared fallback positions, no reserves assembling for a counterblow. Behind the 8th Line lay only open ground, forests thinning into rolling fields, and roads stretching toward the interior of Germany. The entire defensive system, 8 layers deep, had been cracked in under 48 hours. But the consequences went far beyond the battlefield, because when those 8 lines broke, something larger broke with them: Germany's last structural ability to delay the American advance in this sector. And as the battalion dug in on the ridge, preparing for the night, the full weight of what had been accomplished began to settle over commanders on both sides. News of the breakthrough spread faster than any runner or radio report. German units positioned miles behind the 8th Line began to receive fragmented messages, some warning of American penetration, others insisting the line still held, others demanding immediate counterattacks that no longer made tactical sense. The contradictory orders reflected a deeper truth. German command infrastructure in the sector had fractured beyond repair. Several headquarters attempted to re-establish control, but the reality on the ground made it impossible. Supply officers reported they could not move ammunition because convoys had been destroyed on the roads. Communications officers could not contact units that no longer existed as cohesive formations. Staff officers tasked with planning reserves found only scattered groups of exhausted soldiers retreating without direction. The 8-line defensive system had not simply been breached, it had been erased. For the American battalion, the effects were immediate and tangible. Prisoners began arriving in groups, first by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Some were wounded, many were starving, most were too shocked to resist. They spoke of broken companies, abandoned guns, and commanders who had lost all sense of the battlefield shape. The assistant battalion commander noted in his report, "The enemy did not withdraw, they disintegrated." American reconnaissance teams pushed beyond the ridge to confirm this. They found destroyed artillery pieces still warm from firing, trucks abandoned with engines running, field kitchens overturned in the snow, medics treating wounded men who had been left behind by retreating formations. It became clear that the Germans had not expected the Americans to break through all 8 lines. Not this quickly, not with this momentum, not with this level of coordination. Strategic consequences. Breaking the defensive belts had implications far beyond the battalion's immediate sector. Higher command realized the breach created a corridor, one that widened with every hour the Germans failed to regroup. Within 24 hours, additional American regiments were funneled through it, expanding the penetration, deepening the collapse, and accelerating the push toward the Rhine. German generals attempted to pull units from neighboring sectors to plug the gap, but this only weakened those sectors without meaningfully strengthening the one already lost.
Allied air power ensured that any large movement of German forces was detected and struck before it could influence the battlefield. The breach thus became a pivot point, a place where a localized tactical victory ignited an operational collapse. Reports from German field commanders reflected growing desperation. We have no fuel for repositioning. Our left flank has ceased to exist. Units arriving are under strength and without ammunition. We cannot hold without air support. And above all, we require immediate reinforcement. Reinforcement that never arrived. The psychological shift. Among German soldiers who escaped the collapse, the realization sank in quickly. Many had believed the successive lines would slow the Americans enough to stabilize the front. They had assumed that depth, if nothing else, would buy time. But the Americans had not treated the defenses as a sequence of positions. They treated them as a single system to be smashed under continuous pressure. This sense of inevitability spread through German ranks. Soldiers spoke openly of impossibility. Junior officers confided that they could no longer guarantee order. The idea of holding the line, in any structured or cohesive sense, became fiction. Among the Americans, there was no triumphalism, only exhaustion, relief, and a steady recognition that the war had tipped further. The battalion knew it had achieved something extraordinary, but it also knew the cost. Nightfall brought stretcher teams, medics working by lantern light, and the quiet murmur of men who understood they had been part of something decisive. The path forward. As the battalion settled into temporary positions beyond the 8th line, their mission was far from over. Orders arrived at dusk.
Prepare to advance at first light. There would be no pause, no rest, no chance for the German army to rebuild what had been lost. The 8 lines were behind them. Germany lay ahead. And the next day's march would begin a phase of the war that had long been discussed in planning rooms, but never felt so close as it did now. The drive into the heart of the Reich. The consequences of the breakthrough were still unfolding, but one truth had already hardened across the front. The German defensive system was gone, and nothing similar stood between the Americans and the next objective. In the quiet hours after the breakthrough, when the guns fell silent and the wind moved softly through the battered tree line, the battlefield revealed its deeper meaning. The 8 German defensive lines had not been merely physical barriers, trenches, wire, bunkers, and icy ridges. They were the last expression of a strategy built on delay, on the hope that time itself might blunt the American advance long enough for Germany to find a way out of its collapsing war. But time was no longer a weapon Germany possessed. The battalion's 48-hour surge through those defenses did more than open a corridor. It exposed the fundamental shift underway in the final months of the war. The American army had become an engine of sustained momentum, logistically vast, tactically adaptive, and operationally relentless. It was not just superior firepower or greater numbers that carried the battalion forward, but the ability to synchronize every element of modern warfare. Artillery, infantry, engineers, communications, and reconnaissance all moved with a coherence the German army could no longer match. For the Germans who fought on those ridges, the collapse was not a single moment, but a realization. Positions they had believed secure dissolved under pressure. Orders arrived too late or not at all. Every fallback line that was supposed to buy hours instead bought minutes. The layered defense that once symbolized resilience became a symbol of exhaustion. And for the Americans, the victory carried its own weight. No breakthrough came without cost. Every line crossed marked another test of endurance, leadership, and resolve. Yet as they looked across the open ground beyond the 8th line, toward the roads that curved into Germany, they saw not just the next phase of the campaign, but the approaching end of a long and brutal war. The breakthrough was not the final chapter, but it was one of the moments when the war's direction became unmistakable. The defenses had fallen. The momentum had shifted. And the path into the heart of Germany lay open, shaped by the quiet, determined force of a battalion that refused to stop moving forward.